Hello and welcome to the Blender tutorial. I'm your host, Macrodinic. Let's get started. So when we first launch Blender, we're going to get our splash screen. I'm just going to click to get rid of that. And we are introduced into our basic scene here. We have three elements by default. We have a camera, a cube, and a light source. Now, if you've probably already noticed here, we're using our right mouse button to go ahead and select objects. To move around the scene, I can use the middle mouse button. If I just click and hold that, I'm going to start rotating around the scene, though I also have a couple modifiers here. So for example, if I hold the shift and middle mouse button, I'm going to pan and dolly. And if I use the mouse wheel, I will zoom in and out like so. So between these controls right here, you should have a pretty good view of all of your objects. So let's start building out a simple scene here and take a look at some of the fundamental basics of managing objects. So I'm going to go ahead and start though by selecting this cube and then hitting the delete key and enter to delete that item. Okay, so to create objects in Blender, pretty simple. I'm just going to go head over to the create menu right here and I can select from any of these objects. For example, I can add a plane. I can also go to add mesh plane. And finally, a nice shortcut, of which, of course, Blender has plenty. Shift-A will allow me to add from a little context menu that pops up next to my mouse. Now, to select items, again, we hit the right mouse button, but if I hold the Shift and right mouse button, you'll notice I can select multiple objects at once. So let's go ahead and start building on a scene. So I got a plane here. What I'm basically going to do is I'm going to have this plane and then a couple cubes falling from above onto that plane. Now, one of the things I'm going to want to do to start this out is I'm going to want to expand this plane so it's a little bit larger. There's a couple different ways we can do that. So to help us out with that, I'm going to go to View, Properties, and toggle that on. You'll notice there's an N keyboard shortcut here, and that allows me to toggle that quickly. And I'm also going to go into View, Toggle Quad View, which also has another shortcut, Control-Alt-Q. You'll see me use that throughout the remainder of this video to quickly toggle between that view. Now, when we're in that view, probably the easiest way to scale something up is to just hover your mouse over the view that you want to affect that change to and hit the S key on your keyboard. You'll notice your cursor changes to a scale icon, and you can now move the mouse back and forth to scale. There's another one here that's useful, R for rotate, allows me to rotate the object. If you're ever performing one of these operations, you don't want to keep it, just hit escape to reset the object. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a couple cubes onto our scene. So I'm going to hit Shift A here and add one cube. I'm going to move that up. And you can, of course, use things like Control C and Control V to copy and paste elements like so. And I'll do that one more time for a third cube. Now again, using a combination of my, in this case, mouse wheel and shift middle mouse button, I can of course zoom in and out to view my elements. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add a couple rotations to these objects like so, just to give my scene a little bit more of a dynamic visual interest. Now there's one other shortcut I want to show you here which is really helpful, which is selecting an object and hitting the G key. This will allow me to actually move elements basically independent of the little icons, these little handles that you see here, which can be really helpful again when you're just roughly placing objects. Okay, so at this point then, I have my basic scene set up, though I do need to apply some physics to the scene because I want these cubes to tumble down and hit this plane. Now you may find it a little bit strange if we're talking about physics so early in a demo, but there's actually a really good reason for this. It turns out that the properties that we're going to use to apply physics to these objects uses a really common workflow in Blender. In fact, a very, very common workflow. Basically, we select an object in one of our viewports, and we go to our tabs right here to apply properties and manage settings. Now physics is no different. I'm going to select my plane, and under the physics button right here, I'm going to press that, and I'm just going to apply a rigid body to that element. Then I'm going to do that for each one of my cubes, just select and click, and select and click. Now, if I want my plane to not be affected by gravity, and by the way, you don't need to remember this. This is just, again, showing you this workflow, which we're going to use a lot in rendering here in just a couple minutes. Basically, I'm going to uncheck dynamic right here. This is basically going to tell the plane to stay put, but these guys are going to be affected by gravity. So how do we actually render or run a physics simulation? Very simple. We just go to our timeline, which is this view right here. I'm just going to hit this back button a couple times and make sure we're all the way to the beginning of the timeline. And I'm just going to hit play. You'll notice now that my cubes are going to go tumbling down, and again, using a real-life physics simulation here to apply a little bit more of a natural pose for each one of those elements. So again, you'll see this workflow lots and lots now as we talk about rendering and shading. So I have my basic scene here. I want to render it out. How do we actually do that? Well, there's two main ways that we can see a rendered view of our scene. The first is just in our viewports. So if I go down to this menu right here, I can click this and I can select rendered right here. And basically we'll render the scene out, and kind of neat here, we'll actually do so in real time. If I ever want to switch back to my unshaded view, I can just quickly hit the Z key to toggle this back and forth, like so. So at this point then, you can tell here that I'm rendering this scene out. I've got some, I guess you would say, slightly more realistic shading than basic. I have shadows, which are casting onto my plane. The only problem with this, of course, is it's not super realistic, nor is it of very high quality. Now, we're going to take a look at both of those problems. Let's talk about the quality one first. So it turns out that when we're rendering in our viewport like this, we're not actually using the highest quality rendering that we can. There's a good reason for that. This is a preview after all. So it turns out if we actually want to create a final high quality rendering, I'm going to go into my render button right here, and I'm going to click this button right here. So again, notice we applied physics using this button. So much what we do in Blender is in this area right here. So I press render, and then I press this button right here. Now, before I do that, I want to quickly draw your attention to something. Blender has, let's just say, a unique take on user interface. It's probably different from just about anything you've ever used before. And one of the ways that it's different is it'll often change the entire context of the screen that you're looking at. And it can be a little bit tricky to understand how you get back to where you started. And pressing the render button is that in a nutshell. I'm going to press this button. We're going to change our view here to an image view. And then we're going to want to get back to the 3D view. So let me just show you that. So I'm going to press render. The scene gets rendered out, fantastic, but what if I want to change my render? Well, to do that, I'm going to use this right down here. Now, when you get into the Blender user interface more, you're going to become very familiar with how you can change any of our views right here, but this is your first exposure to it. I select from this list of views, and I select 3D view. And this will now toggle us back. Now, this is actually common enough to where I'm going to actually show you a shortcut for this. If I want to render out my scene, instead of pressing this button, I can just hit F12 on my keyboard. And if I want to go back to my 3D view, I'll make sure my mouse is over the view I want to change, and I'll hit Shift F5. So that little shortcut, F12, Shift F5, can be really, really useful when you're experimenting with render. Now, I will also say that that shortcut, that Shift F5, will also apply this to other views. So I can get my Python console by hitting Shift F4. If I hit F6, I'll get my timeline view, etc., my curves, so on and so forth. So very easy to switch back and forth, but just be aware that that's really different probably from what you're used to. Okay, so rendering out my scene, but there's two strange things that you're probably noticing. The first, if I switch back to wireframe here, is that the view that we actually get is not the same that's in my viewport. So for example, let's say I look straight down at my cubes. When I press that render button, I'm not actually looking at that view. I'm looking at something different. Well, it turns out the reason why is because when you render, by default, you're actually looking through this guy, the camera. So how do we control that? We just press 0 on our numpad. You notice now that I'm actually going to zoom into the camera. If I press 0 again, I'll toggle out of that. Now, how do I actually change my view? Now, the reason why I say that is because, unfortunately, if I use my middle mouse button like I have the entire other rest of the video, you'll notice here that I just break out of the camera, right? If I press 0 to get back in the camera, it doesn't make a difference. I'm always breaking out of it. Well, it turns out in order to move this camera, I hit Shift and F. And that changed into what I call first-person perspective. And then I can use the W, A, S, and D keys in combination with the Shift key to speed up motion right here. And now that's how I'm actually controlling this view. You can basically see, of course, with the safe area, in other words, the non-dimmed out area, that's what I'm actually going to render. Now, when I'm happy with the view that I have, I'm going to hit the left mouse button. And there it is. I can hit F12, and that's what I render out. So, up until this point then, things look okay. We can basically move around the workspace, I can render, but something still looks a little bit wrong, doesn't it? This render that I'm getting is not very accurate. In fact, it looks pretty old school. Well, it turns out the reason why is because by default, the renderer that we use in Blender is a very simple ray tracer. It doesn't actually calculate light bouncing off of objects. To actually do that, I'm going to go up to this menu right here, and I'm going to change my renderer from Blender to Cycles. And now you're instantly going to notice that my scene looks much more realistic right here. Right? You'll notice that the areas where there's not direct light are no longer 100% black. My shadows look more realistic, etc. However, this still isn't perfect. Now, it turns out that one of the things that happens when I render a scene like this using the Cycles renderer is that it's going to actually do two things. It's going to take the world color into account when it's rendering, and it's going to use these lights, and it may not always create the most realistic result. So a lot of times what you want to do is you want to create a more realistic light source. And so let me show you exactly what I mean by that by just doing these two things. So I'm going to switch my renderer over here to rendered. I'm going to actually quickly draw your attention to this. This is the outliner right here. Very simply, this just allows me to select objects in the world, which is very helpful when I'm on my rendered preview right here, because it gets a little bit harder to select things. I can still do it. Notice here, if I right click, I'm actually changing what's selected, but it's hard to select things like a light because the lamp doesn't actually have a physical presence. So I select my light right here, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete the light source. I'm going to right click and hit delete. And now notice that the scene isn't perfectly black, right? There is no light source in this scene anymore, but we still have light. And it turns out the reason why that is because the world itself, and I click the world tab right here, is actually applying light to the scene. So by default, the world has a surface, and the surface is this light. And the Cycles render is actually taking that and incorporating it into a render. So if I actually want to create a more realistic scene, I probably want to turn that light all the way off like so. Now, of course, at this point, it's pitch black, so let's create a light source. And the way we're actually going to do that is this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a plane in my scene. I'm going to move that plane up. I'm going to rotate it a little bit and use my G key to move it over. And I'm actually going to apply a material so that this becomes a source of light. It emits light. So to do that, we're going to use the same workflow that we saw before with the physics. I have an object selected. I'm going to go into my Materials button right here, and I'm just going to click New under Material. When I do that, then I can choose my surface, and the surface that I'm going to choose is going to be emission. Now, just to show you the stark difference that makes, I'm going to actually switch back into rendered mode right here, try to zoom in just a little bit, and now I'm going to change my surface to emission. You're going to notice now immediately that this starts to emit light into my scene, and I can do things then like change the strength of that light here to basically create this right here. So that then is one of the ways that we create more realistic lighting in the Blender renderer, is by creating a physical object that's basically emitting lots and lots of little light particles that then illuminate my scene and create more realistic lighting and shadows. Now what's cool about this is you can even do things like create bounce objects. So for example, I have one light source that's bouncing down. I can go in here and I can hit, we'll just go back into our regular default shading here. Basically create a plane, and I can zoom it up like this, rotate it, and maybe scale it. Use that G key again to move it. And basically this is going to now bounce light back onto the other side of these cubes. And so you basically play around with this then to make the most realistic type of lighting that you want. Okay, so at this point then, there's probably a few last things I want to talk about when it comes to rendering, because you may notice right here that the quality of this rendering that I'm getting here isn't very good. Basically, we have all of these little spots when we render. Now, this is a very big topic, and I don't want to go too deep, but basically what's happening is when we render in the Cycles render, it's all based on how many samples you're sending out into the scene. So if I hit render button right here and go down to the sampling preset, I can basically change the number of samples that we shoot into the scene. Basically, the more samples that we have, the higher quality the rendering is get, because there's more samples taken of these objects. So instead of this real defined dithering pattern, it's going to become much more smooth. Now there's other cool things that we can play with as well. So for example, I can turn on motion blur. When I turn on motion blur, it's not actually going to be shown in my preview right here, but if I do my final rendering using F12, it actually will be shown. Now, of course, this is all going to depend on how I've actually created my scene. So for example, if I don't have objects that are in heavy motion, I'm not really going to see a whole lot of motion blur. So for example, I can just go back in here and I can redo this scene. So maybe I get to an area with a little bit more motion, and when I render this out now, you'll see the motion blur really taking hold. So something like that creates a much more realistic result. Now, the other thing I can do just real quickly to show you is I can actually apply materials, that is different colors and textures, to objects very simply as well. So for example, if I select my plane right here, I can go back to the materials tab, I can add a new material, and instead of making it a emission surface, I can just change the color of it, right? I can change it to this light blue color right here, and now that is what that object's color is going to be. And of course, you can do that with textures and lots of other things as well. So there it is. There's the introduction to Blender tutorial. We basically worked with the camera a little bit. We can now manipulate the scene, move around. We've created a render. We've even added basic physics simulations to this. Blender is obviously a huge program. We've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully this gives you the amount of knowledge you need to at least work with Blender on a more confident basis. Thanks for watching. Any comments, please leave them below.